Between October 8th and 12th, 1986, 14 people were eliminated across the remote hollows of Harlan County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Pritchard Purge. All adults, all connected to a single moonshine operation. The method was surgical rifle shots from distance, close-range shotgun blasts, and ambushes on dark mountain roads that left no survivors. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or federal agents or organized crime syndicates. They were 4 members of the Pritchard family, all brothers, all born with achondroplasia dwarfism, standing between 4 feet 2 inches and 4 feet 6 inches tall, moving through the mountains like vengeful spirits that no one saw coming. The FBI would later call it one of the most coordinated family eliminations in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even revenge for violence done against them. It was a copper moonshine still worth $22,000, built by their grandfather in 1931, stolen by men they'd once called neighbors. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Harlan County, Kentucky, sprawled across 467 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1986. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient walls, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few hours each day. Population stood around 31,000, down from 75,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king. The county seat, also called Harlan, held barely 2,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back decades. October in Harlan meant temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night, creeping up to maybe 60 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces mixed with the sweet rot of fallen leaves and the metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear owls calling across the hollows and the distant barking of dogs, chained outside trailers and cabins scattered through the hills. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you. Warren Pritchard was 48 years old that October, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. He stood 4 feet 5 inches tall, his body built with the muscular density common to people with achondroplasia. His shoulders were broad and powerful, his arms thick with muscle developed from decades of physical labor that never got easier because the world wasn't built for men his size. His face was weathered like old leather, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into smoke and sun, a scar along his left cheekbone from a bar fight in 1963 when someone had called him a name he wouldn't repeat. His hands were massive relative to his frame, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never set quite right, calluses thick as boot leather from handling copper and corn and wood for 30 years. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the accumulation of a lifetime spent, proving he was as capable as any man twice his height. Every morning, Warren woke at 4:30 in the house his father had built in 1947, made coffee in a percolator on a wood stove, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee so strong it could strip paint, and thought. By 5:30 he'd be out the door, checking the still hidden 3 miles back in the woods, following trails only he and his brothers knew. He'd married Linda Sue Morrison in 1961, right after his youngest brother Bobby was born, and Warren realized he needed to start building something permanent. They'd had 3 children. Michael was 23 now, also born with dwarfism, working at the feed store in town. Sarah was 21, average height, married to a coal miner. Tommy was 18, average height, trying to figure out who he was beyond being Warren Pritchard's son. Linda was 46, her hands as work-worn as Warren's, her face still beautiful, despite everything the mountains had demanded from her. Clayton Pritchard was 45, standing 4 feet 6 inches, the tallest of the brothers and the most religious. He attended the Baptist church every Sunday, taught Sunday school, and genuinely believed that God had a plan even for men like them. His wife Rebecca had given him 4 children, all average height, all struggling with the stigma of having a father the town called names behind his back. Donnie Pritchard was 42, 4 feet 3 inches of concentrated anger. He'd spent his entire life fighting, literally and figuratively, against a world that treated him like a curiosity. His wife had left him in 1979, taking their 2 daughters. He lived alone in a trailer on the family property, drank too much, and kept a loaded shotgun by his bed. Bobby Pritchard was 38, the youngest and smallest at 4 feet 2 inches, but also the smartest. He'd finished high school, had even taken some classes at the community college before money ran out. His wife Janet and their 2 sons lived in the original family home with Warren's family, all sharing the property their grandfather had cleared by hand in 1923. What the Pritchard brothers valued most wasn't money. They'd never had much anyway. What they valued was dignity, the kind that came from honest work and family loyalty, and they valued their grandfather's copper still, not because of its market value, but because it represented 3 generations of Pritchard men who'd refused to starve when the world offered them nothing but contempt. Ezra Pritchard had built the still in 1931, during the Depression, when men were jumping out of windows in New York City and families in Harlan County were eating boiled grass to stay alive. Ezra stood 5 feet 8 inches, average height, but 3 of his 4 sons would be born with achondroplasia, a genetic mutation that occurred randomly, cruelly, in families with no history of it. The still was his legacy to them, a way to ensure they could survive in a world that wouldn't hire them, wouldn't accommodate them, wouldn't see them as fully human. The construction was all copper, hand-hammered, and welded with techniques Ezra had learned from his own father, who'd learned from moonshiners in Scotland before immigrating in 1887. 250-gallon capacity with a custom-built condenser coil that spiraled through cold spring water, creating the smoothest shine in 3 counties. The copper itself was worth maybe $800 in 1931. By 1986, with copper prices skyrocketing, that same still was worth $22,000, not counting the craftsmanship, the history, the fact that you couldn't build another one like it even if you had the money. The recipe the Pritchards used wasn't particularly special. Yellow corn, sugar, yeast, spring water. The standard formula that every moonshiner in Appalachia knew by heart. What made Pritchard shine valuable wasn't the recipe. It was the still itself. Copper conducted heat perfectly, eliminated impurities that stainless steel couldn't touch, and imparted a subtle sweetness to the final product. The Pritchard copper still produced shine that sold for $15 a gallon when everyone else got $10. That $5 difference, multiplied across hundreds of gallons per year, was the difference between survival and starvation for 4 families. But 1986 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Harlan County for nearly a century was in free fall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 43%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families, except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps, that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. In that economic wasteland, the Pritchard family moonshine operation sustained 11 people. Warren's family of 5, Clayton's family of 6, Donnie alone, and Bobby's family of 4. The still ran twice a week, producing roughly 30 gallons per run, 60 gallons per week, 240 gallons per month. At $15 per gallon, that was $3,600 monthly, split 4 ways, $900 per brother. Not wealth, but survival. Enough to keep the lights on, food on the table, and dignity intact. The Pritchard property sat on 47 acres of steep hillside 3 miles outside the nearest paved road. Posted signs every 50 feet around the perimeter. No trespassing. Private property. Violators will be prosecuted. The signs had been there since Ezra's time, yellowed and rusted now, but still legible. Still ignored by people who thought the Pritchards were too small, too weak, too insignificant to defend what was theirs. The still itself was hidden another 3 miles into the woods, accessible only by a trail so narrow and overgrown that you had to know where to look to find it. The location had been chosen specifically because the Pritchard brothers could navigate the terrain better than average-sized men. Their low center of gravity, their powerful legs, their lifetime of adaptation meant they could move through underbrush that would stop someone 6 feet tall. That still represented everything. 3 generations of work. The only inheritance Ezra Pritchard could leave his sons in a world where men like them had nothing else. It wasn't just copper and corn. It was identity. It was proof that being small didn't mean being helpless. And when it was stolen on August 23rd, 1986, it became a death sentence for 14 men who thought the Pritchards wouldn't fight back. Ray Shepard was 52 years old that summer, a tall man at 6 feet 1 inch, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of never being challenged. He'd inherited his father's moonshine operation in 1974, expanded it aggressively, and by 1986, controlled distribution networks across Harlan, Letcher, and Bell counties. His operation employed his 3 sons, 2 nephews, a brother-in-law, 3 cousins, and assorted hangers-on who did the grunt work for a cut of the profits. 14 men total, all adults, all knowing exactly what they were doing when they helped steal the Pritchard copper still. Ray had grown up 3 hollows over from the Pritchards, attended the same school, though he was 8 years older than Warren. He'd spent his childhood making jokes about the Pritchard boys, laughing when they struggled to reach water fountains, tripping them in hallways, calling them names that adults pretended not to hear. As an adult, he'd graduated to more sophisticated cruelty, undercutting their prices, spreading rumors about the quality of their shine, intimidating their buyers with threats of violence. But the Pritchard copper still was the one thing Ray couldn't compete with. Their product was simply better, commanded higher prices, and earned customer loyalty that Ray's stainless steel operation couldn't match. The Shepherd moonshine operation ran out of a barn on Ray's property, visible from the road if you knew what you were looking at. Stainless steel equipment, modern and efficient, but producing shine that tasted harsh, that burned going down, that people bought because it was cheap and available, not because it was good. Ray sold his product for $10 a gallon, sometimes $8 when competition was tight, moving volume through sheer market saturation. But he watched the Pritchards sell theirs for $15, and it ate at him like acid. Not because he needed the money. Ray's operation grossed over $100,000 annually, but because 4 little men in the next hollow over had something he couldn't take. Until August 19th, 1986, when Ray Shepherd was drinking at Mel's Tavern and overheard Curtis Brennan, the old bartender, mention that Warren Pritchard would be in Lexington all day August 23rd, driving his daughter to her new apartment near the university. Ray bought Curtis 3 more beers, asked casual questions about the Pritchard operation, learned that all 4 brothers would be gone that day, helping with the move, leaving the still unguarded for the first time in memory. Ray gathered his sons that night. Michael was 30, married with 2 kids, running the distribution side of the operation. Danny was 27, handling production, already developing the alcoholism that ran in the Shepherd family. Tyler was 24, the enforcer, 6 feet 3 inches and 240 pounds of muscle and meanness. Together with Ray's nephews, his brother-in-law Marcus Webb, and the others, they planned the theft with the same casual confidence of men who'd never faced real consequences. The operation took 6 men and 2 trucks on August 23rd. They drove up the trail at 10 in the morning, found the still exactly where Curtis said it would be, and spent 4 hours disconnecting the copper apparatus, loading it piece by piece into the truck beds. The still weighed over 800 pounds, required careful dismantling to avoid damage, but Ray had brought cutting torches and heavy equipment. By 2 in the afternoon, the Pritchard copper still was on Ray Shepherd's property, being reassembled in his barn, and 14 men were celebrating the greatest theft in Harlan County moonshine history. What Ray didn't consider, what none of them considered, was that the Pritchard brothers weren't like other men who'd been pushed around their entire lives. They hadn't developed the survival strategy of backing down, of accepting loss, of letting insults and theft slide in the name of avoiding conflict. They'd developed the opposite strategy. They'd learned that being small meant you had to be willing to go further than the other guy, had to be willing to commit to violence absolutely, had to prove every single time that backing down wasn't an option. Ray Shepherd thought he was stealing a piece of equipment. What he'd actually done was sign a death warrant for himself and 13 other men. 11:17 on the night of August 23rd, 1986. Temperature 68 degrees. Humidity near 100% after an afternoon thunderstorm. Fog rolling down from the ridges like something alive, cutting visibility to maybe 30 feet. Warren Pritchard drove his 1979 Ford F-150 up the narrow trail toward the still site, Linda Sue sleeping in the passenger seat after the long drive back from Lexington. They dropped Sarah at her apartment, helped her unpack, driven 4 hours home through mountain roads that turned to mud in the rain. Warren was exhausted, but he always checked the still before bed. Always. It was ritual, religion, responsibility. He parked where the trail ended, grabbed his flashlight, told Linda he'd be back in 10 minutes. The walk to the still site took 5 minutes through woods he could navigate blind, following a path worn smooth by 3 generations of Pritchard boots. The fog made everything strange, turned familiar trees into ghost shapes, swallowed sound until the only thing Warren could hear was his own breathing and the crunch of wet leaves under his feet. He smelled the absence before he saw it. The still site always carried a particular scent, the sweet fermentation smell of mash working, the metallic tang of copper, the wood smoke from the firebox. Tonight, Warren smelled only wet earth and decaying leaves. He stopped walking, felt his heart accelerate, told himself there was an explanation, an innocent reason the smell was wrong. Then he stepped into the clearing and saw nothing. Empty space where the still had stood. The ground disturbed, deep ruts from truck tires, broken branches where something large had been dragged through the underbrush. The firebox cold and abandoned. The fermentation barrels tipped over, mash spilled across the ground, soaking into soil that would smell like corn alcohol for weeks. Warren stood in the fog holding his flashlight, the beam cutting through white vapor and illuminating nothing. Absolutely nothing, where his grandfather's copper still should have been. His hands started shaking, not from fear but from rage so profound it felt like something breaking inside his chest. He walked the perimeter of the site, following the truck tracks, seeing where 2 vehicles had backed in, seeing the boot prints of multiple men, counting at least 6 different tread patterns. The trail led down the mountain toward the main road, toward property that adjoined Shepherd Land 3 miles west. He drove home, woke his brothers with phone calls that consisted of 4 words each. Still's gone. Come now. By midnight, all 4 Pritchard brothers stood in the empty clearing, flashlights revealing the devastation, the theft, the absolute violation of everything their family had built. Clayton was praying quietly, tears running down his face. Donnie was silent, which was more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. Bobby was examining the tire tracks with the methodical focus of someone cataloging evidence. Warren stood in the center of the clearing, feeling something die inside him that had nothing to do with the still itself, and everything to do with the last shred of belief that the world would leave them alone if they just stayed quiet and worked hard. Shepherd, Bobby said, pointing to a specific tire tread. "That's the pattern on Ray's Chevy. I've seen it in town." They followed the trail in Warren's truck, driving without headlights, using the fog as cover, following ruts that grew fresher as they descended toward the valley. The tracks led exactly where Warren knew they would lead. Straight to Ray Shepard's barn, where light blazed from inside, where Warren could see through the gaps in the wood siding the unmistakable shape of copper, reflecting lantern light, where voices carried through the night air Ray's distinctive laugh, his sons celebrating. 14 men who thought they'd gotten away with it. Warren parked 200 yards away, killed the engine, sat in darkness watching the barn. Clayton sat beside him, Bobby and Donnie in the back seat. No one spoke for 5 minutes. Then Warren opened his door, didn't say anything, just walked toward the barn with his brothers following. They didn't bring weapons. This was reconnaissance, confirmation, making absolutely certain before they crossed the line they were all thinking about crossing. Warren knocked on the barn door. Ray answered, saw Warren standing there barely reaching the man's chest, and smiled. "Help you with something, little man?" Warren looked past Ray, saw his copper still being reassembled, saw his grandfather's craftsmanship in the hands of thieves. "That's mine," Warren said quietly. Ray's smile widened. "Don't know what you're talking about. This still's been in my family for years." Warren stood there, looking up at Ray Shepard's face, seeing the absolute confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable. "I want it back," Warren said. Ray laughed, actually laughed. "Prove it's yours. Take me to court. Do whatever you think you can do. But we both know how that ends." Warren nodded slowly, turned, walked back to his truck. His brothers followed. They drove home in silence. The war had started. Ray Shepard just didn't know it yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Bobby Pritchard conducted surveillance with the methodical precision of someone who understood that rage without evidence was just violence, but rage with documentation was justice. He was the smallest of the brothers at 4 feet 2 inches, which meant he could hide in places no average-sized man could fit. Behind fallen logs, inside hollow trees, beneath the undercarriage of abandoned vehicles that littered the woods around Shepard property. He brought binoculars, a camera with a telephoto lens, purchased with money they couldn't afford to spend, and the infinite patience of a man who'd spent his entire life being underestimated. September 1st, Bobby photographed Ray Shepard and his son Michael running a batch using the Pritchard copper still. The distinctive condenser coil was unmistakable, the hand-hammered copper panels showing the same dents and repairs that Bobby's grandfather had made in 1943 after a federal raid damaged the equipment. September 3rd, he photographed Danny Shepard teaching his cousin how to operate the system, pointing out the specific temperature requirements that only mattered with copper equipment. September 7th, he documented Marcus Webb, Ray's brother-in-law, taking delivery of raw materials, corn and sugar, arriving in quantities that matched expanded production capacity. By September 14th, Bobby had photographed all 14 men involved in the operation, each one handling the stolen still, each one complicit in the theft, each one now documented on film that would never see the inside of a courtroom, but would serve a different kind of justice entirely. The brothers met nightly at Warren's kitchen table, spreading Bobby's photographs across the worn wood surface, studying faces they'd known their entire lives. Ray Shepard, 52, who'd been calling them names since elementary school. His sons Michael, 30, Danny, 27, and Tyler, 24, raised to view the Pritchards as less than human. Ray's brother Randall, 48, who'd once refused to serve Warren at his hardware store, made him wait outside while average-sized customers went first. Ray's nephews, Jimmy, 26, Carl, 24, and Thomas, 22, third generation of shepherd contempt. Marcus Webb, 51, married to Ray's sister Linda, who'd laughed when Donnie Pritchard asked for a job at his lumber mill. Webb's two sons, Marcus Jr., 28, and David, 25, continuing the family tradition of casual cruelty. Ray's cousins, Frank, 35, and Billy, 32, hired muscle who'd threatened Bobby outside the feed store just last year. And Ezra Shepherd, Ray's youngest son, 22, newly married, not yet hardened by his family's culture, but complicit nonetheless. 14 men, Clayton said on September 14th, his voice carrying the weight of prayer and resignation. 14 souls. Warren looked at his brother, saw the conflict there. The religious man, wrestling with mathematics that didn't care about salvation. 14 men who know, Warren corrected. Every one of them handles our copper every day. Every one of them profits from what Papa built. Donnie didn't speak, just cleaned his shotgun with movements so deliberate they bordered on ritualistic. Bobby organized the photographs chronologically, creating a visual timeline of theft, becoming routine operation. "We take this to the sheriff," Bobby said, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Warren shook his head. "Sheriff buys his shine from Ray, has for 15 years. The words hung in the air like smoke, acknowledging the fundamental truth they'd all known but hadn't wanted to speak aloud. There was no legal recourse, no authority that would intervene, no system that would protect 4 small men against 14 regular-sized men who controlled the local economy, who had connections, who were seen as normal and therefore deserving of benefit of doubt." Clayton spoke quietly, still struggling. "There's got to be another way. We could, I don't know, steal it back. Just take the still and disappear into the next county." Warren looked at his brother with something like pity. "They know where we live. They know our families. We steal it back, they kill us, or worse, they kill our wives, our children. They've already shown they don't respect boundaries." The logic was irrefutable. The Shepherds had committed an act of economic warfare, destroyed the Pritchard family's only income source, and demonstrated absolute contempt for any concept of consequences. Stealing it back would solve nothing. It would only escalate conflict the Pritchards couldn't win through conventional means. "They didn't just steal property," Clayton said, repeating words he'd spoken before. "They stole Papa's memory. They took the only thing we had that proved we mattered." Warren nodded slowly, his massive hands flat on the table, fingers spread across photographs of 14 men who thought they'd gotten away with it. "That's exactly right," Warren said. "And the only way to protect Papa's legacy now is to make sure nobody else ever knows how to use it." The words carried implications that didn't need clarification. Bobby gathered the photographs, placed them in an envelope, filed them with the documentation he'd been building. Evidence that would never be shown to police, but would serve as justification, as reminder, as the foundation for what came next. 14 men had signed their own death warrants by touching Pritchard copper. They just didn't know it yet. The brothers sat in silence as the September night deepened around them, as temperatures dropped toward 50 degrees, as the mountains settled into the particular quiet that comes before irrevocable action. They were crossing a threshold, transforming from victims into something else entirely, something the mountains would remember for generations. September 16th, 1986, 9:30 in the morning. Temperature 58 degrees with clear skies. Warren Pritchard walked into the Harlan County Sheriff's Office carrying Bobby's photographs in a manila envelope and the last shreds of faith that the system might work. Sheriff Tom Breckenridge was 54 years old, had held his position for 18 years through a combination of mountain connections and willful blindness to crimes that didn't affect the right people. He looked up from his desk when Warren entered, and something flickered across his face that might have been guilt or might have been annoyance at having to deal with a complication he'd hoped would resolve itself quietly. "Warren," Breckenridge said, not standing, not offering a handshake, maintaining the careful distance that authority figures kept from men they didn't quite see as equals. "What can I do for you?" Warren placed the envelope on the desk, his hands steady despite the rage that had been building for 3 weeks. "Ray Shepard stole our family's moonshine still on August 23rd. I have photographs documenting him and 13 other men using our property. I'm filing a formal complaint and requesting you arrest them for theft." Breckenridge didn't open the envelope, didn't even touch it, just looked at Warren with the tired expression of a man who'd already decided how this conversation would end. "Now, Warren, that's a serious accusation. Moonshining's illegal in the first place. You can't exactly report the theft of illegal equipment." Warren felt something cold settle in his chest, the confirmation of what he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. The still itself is legal. It's antique equipment, copper, worth $22,000. The theft is felony grand larceny regardless of what it's used for. Breckenridge leaned back in his chair, studying Warren the way you'd study an insect that was behaving unexpectedly. "You have receipts proving ownership? You have serial numbers? Any actual documentation beyond some photographs that could show anything?" Warren didn't respond, knowing the trap, knowing that any documentation of the still would require admitting to its illegal use, would expose his entire family to federal prosecution. "Thought so," Breckenridge continued. "Look, this is a civil matter. You think Ray took something from you. Hire a lawyer, take him to court. That's how these things get resolved." Warren stood there, 4 feet 5 inches tall, looking up at the sheriff who bought Ray Shepard's moonshine every month, who'd been photographed by Bobby at Ray's barn just last week, picking up his regular order. "We both know there's no court that'll help me," Warren said quietly. Breckenridge shrugged, an eloquent gesture of institutional indifference. "Then I guess you're out of luck. Now I've got real police work to do, so if you don't mind." Warren picked up the envelope, turned, walked out of the sheriff's office into September sunlight that felt too bright, too normal for the death sentence that had just been confirmed. The law, such as it existed in Harlan County, had no interest in protecting 4 small men from 14 regular-sized thieves. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, protecting those with connections and power, while leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. He drove directly to Clayton's house, then to Donnie's trailer, then to Bobby's room in the family home. Gathering his brothers without explanation, bringing them back to his kitchen where this had started, where it would continue until, one way or another, it reached its inevitable conclusion. "Sheriff won't help," Warren said without preamble. "Told me it's a civil matter. Told me to hire a lawyer." Clayton closed his eyes, praying silently. Donnie smiled without humor. Bobby just nodded, having predicted this exact outcome. "So we're on our own," Bobby said. "Always were," Warren replied. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The answer hung unspoken in the air between them. The only answer that made sense in a world where legal protection didn't exist for men like them, where their father's legacy was being used to profit men who'd spent lifetimes making sure the Pritchards stayed small in every sense of the word. Clayton spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Papa used to say a man who won't protect his own ain't a man at all. Said it's the first law. Older than courts, older than sheriffs. You protect what's yours." Warren nodded slowly. "Said that the night before he died. Told me the mountains had their own justice, and sometimes a man had to be willing to enforce it himself." Donnie added his voice, harder than Clayton's, carrying 42 years of accumulated rage. "They took what we can't replace. They profit from it daily. They know we can't stop them through law. What exactly do they think we're going to do? Just accept it?" Bobby, always the logical one, laid out the mathematics. 14 men know this deal intimately now. Even if we stole it back somehow, they'd just build another one, or steal ours again. The only way to actually protect what's ours is to eliminate everyone who learned from it. The words echoed in the kitchen like a judge pronouncing sentence. Clayton flinched, his faith warring with his understanding of necessity. Warren looked at each of his brothers in turn, seeing his own face reflected in theirs. The same genes that had made them different from birth, the same experiences that had taught them the world offered neither mercy nor fairness. "If we do this," Warren said slowly, giving each word weight, "there's no going back. We'll be making ourselves into something we can't unmake. We'll be proving every bad thing people ever said about us." Donnie's response was immediate. "People already think we're monsters. Difference is we'll be monsters who protected what mattered." The four brothers sat in silence as afternoon light filtered through kitchen windows, as temperatures climbed towards 65 degrees, as the world outside continued its normal routines, completely unaware that 14 men had just been condemned to death by 4 small judges who'd exhausted every other option. October 6th, 1986, Monday evening. Temperature 41 degrees with frost forming on the windows, the kind of cold that announced winter's approach and reminded everyone that time in the mountains was measured in seasons of survival. Warren Pritchard sent Linda Sue and the children to stay with her sister in Bell County, told them he needed the house for a few days of private business. Clayton sent Rebecca and their 4 children to her mother's place in Virginia. Bobby sent Janet and the boys to Louisville, where her brother lived. Donnie had no one to send away, which somehow made everything easier for him. By 7 o'clock, the 4 Pritchard brothers sat alone around Warren's kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten thousands of family meals, where their father had taught them to read, where Warren had received the moonshine recipe on his 18th birthday, where every important family decision for 3 generations had been made. Warren had laid out a simple meal before the meeting: cornbread, beans, fried potatoes. Food their grandfather would have recognized, would have approved of. They ate in silence, each man aware they were participating in something ritualistic, something that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. When the plates were cleared, Warren placed Bobby's photographs on the table, 14 faces staring up at them. 14 men who would never see October 13th. Last chance to walk away, Warren said, though everyone in the room knew there was no walking away. Hadn't been since August 23rd when the still disappeared. We do this, we're becoming exactly what people always said we were. Dangerous, violent, something to be afraid of. Clayton, the religious one, spoke through tears that ran down his weathered face. I've prayed every night for 3 weeks, asked God to show me another way, to give me any sign that there's a solution that doesn't involve this. And every morning I wake up and Ray Shepard is still using Papa's still profiting, still teaching his family that stealing from us has no consequences. His voice broke. I think maybe God's answer is that sometimes righteous men have to do terrible things. That's what judges did in the Old Testament, what warriors did when their people were threatened. Donnie's contribution was simpler, more direct. They thought we wouldn't fight back because we're small, because we've taken shit our entire lives and never really pushed back hard enough to make it stop. This is how we make it stop. This is how we make sure everyone in 3 counties knows that Pritchard property is sacred, that crossing us means death. Bobby, always analytical, laid out the practical argument. We're not strong enough to fight them physically, not one-on-one. We're not connected enough to beat them legally. We're not rich enough to outlast them economically. The only advantage we have is that they don't take us seriously. They think we're harmless. That gives us surprise. And surprise plus planning equals tactical superiority. He spread a hand-drawn map across the table, showing the locations of all 14 targets spread across 3 hollows and 12 miles of mountain terrain. We can do this. We can do it methodically. We can do it in a way that ensures none of them warn the others. Warren studied the map, seeing his brother's intelligence displayed in careful notations of roads, distances, estimated response times, tactical approaches. Bobby had spent 2 weeks planning this, treating it like a military operation, which in a sense it was. Asymmetric warfare conducted by 4 small soldiers against 14 regular-sized enemies who controlled superior resources but lacked caution. How long? Warren asked. Bobby traced routes with his finger. 4 nights. Maybe 5. We can't do all 14 in one night without rushing, without making mistakes. We need to be methodical, careful. Make sure each one is confirmed before moving to the next. Clayton absorbed this, processing the timeline of horror they were proposing. 4 nights of killing, 4 nights of crossing, and recrossing the line between man and murderer. Warren corrected him gently. 1 night of crossing. 3 nights of living with what we became on the first night. They planned until midnight, working through logistics with the same attention to detail they'd brought to every family enterprise. Weapons, 4 rifles, 2 shotguns, 3 pistols, all legally owned, all registered, all impossible to disown afterward, but that didn't matter because they weren't planning to run. Strategy: prioritize the youngest first, the men least likely to be missed immediately, the ones whose absences wouldn't trigger immediate alarm. Then work up the chain to Ray Shepard last. Let him spend his final hours wondering why his family was disappearing. Timing. Late night and early morning when people were isolated. When response times were longest. When the fog that rolled through the mountains created natural cover. Witnesses. None. They'd been invisible their entire lives. Nobody looked at them long enough to remember details. That invisibility, that lifetime of being dismissed and overlooked, would be their greatest tactical advantage. At 12:17 in the morning, October 7th, the four brothers joined hands around the kitchen table, something they hadn't done since childhood. Clayton spoke a prayer that was half request for forgiveness and half battle cry. Lord, we're about to do something terrible. We know it, we accept it, but we also know you see everything, including how we've been treated, including what was stolen from us, including the fact that no earthly justice exists for men like us. So we ask not for your blessing because we don't deserve it, but for your understanding. And when we're judged, as we will be, we ask that you weigh our actions against our lifetimes of being treated as less than human. Amen. The brothers released hands. Warren looked at each of them in turn. We're past the point of no return. Everyone understand that? We're about to become something we can't unbecome. Three heads nodded. The Pritchard brothers rose from the table, transformed by decision and necessity into something the mountains hadn't seen before. Four small men with nothing left to lose and a bloodline to protect. October 8th was 3 hours away. 14 men were sleeping peacefully in their beds, completely unaware that 4 judges had pronounced sentence and 4 executioners were preparing to carry it out. Tuesday, October 7th, 1986, 4:30 in the morning. Temperature 38 degrees with frost coating everything in white crystal. Warren Pritchard began the methodical preparation for war. He retrieved his Winchester Model 70 rifle from the gun safe, the weapon his father had given him in 1963 when Warren turned 25, and officially became the family patriarch after his father's death. The rifle was chambered in .30-06 Springfield, powerful enough to drop a 200-pound deer at 300 yards, more than sufficient for the task ahead. He cleaned it with the ritual care of someone who understood that precision mattered, that respect for tools was respect for the work they performed. Next came his Remington 870 shotgun, 12-gauge, loaded with double-aught buckshot. Close-range work. The kind of weapon you used when you needed to be absolutely certain. Clayton brought his Browning A-Bolt rifle, 3-08 Winchester, and his Mossberg 500 shotgun. Donnie contributed his Ruger Mini 14, semi-automatic, 30-round magazine capacity, the closest thing to military hardware any of them owned. Bobby, smallest and least physically imposing, carried a Smith & Wesson Model 686 revolver, .357 Magnum, 6 shots, more than enough for the distances he'd be working at. They laid the weapons on Warren's kitchen table, 9 firearms, representing every legally owned weapon the family possessed, cleaned and loaded, and ready for purposes their manufacturers would never advertise. Bobby spread his hand-drawn maps across the table, 14 locations, marked with precise coordinates determined from 2 weeks of surveillance. He'd color-coded them, red for highest priority targets, men who'd been most actively involved in the theft, yellow for secondary targets, men who'd assisted but weren't primary perpetrators, green for Ray Shepard himself, saved for last, the final name on a list written in inevitability. "We start with Ezra Shepard," Bobby said, pointing to the youngest name on the list. "He's 22, just married, living in a trailer a mile outside his father's compound. Isolated, single-access road. We can approach from the woods, no nearby witnesses." Clayton's face tightened at the mention of starting with the youngest, but he didn't object. They'd already crossed the moral threshold. Debating specifics was just postponing the inevitable. Warren examined the routes Bobby had mapped, seeing the tactical genius in his youngest brother's planning. The targets were arranged not geographically, but strategically, each elimination calculated to delay discovery, to prevent warning, to ensure they could work methodically through the entire list before law enforcement understood what was happening. 4 nights, Warren said, confirming the timeline. 3 or 4 targets per night. We work separately when it makes sense, together when it doesn't. Nobody takes unnecessary risks. We're not trying to be heroes. We're trying to complete a job. Donnie, the angriest of them, the one most likely to let emotion override tactics, nodded understanding. "Quick and clean, no suffering if we can help it. This isn't about torture, it's about elimination." They spent the day preparing vehicles. Warren's 1979 Ford F-150 and Bobby's 1982 Chevy C10, both trucks common enough in Harlan County to be invisible. They disabled the dome lights, taped over brake lights to reduce visibility, covered license plates with mud that could be explained away as normal mountain driving. They loaded equipment, flashlights with red filters that preserved night vision, rope for securing access points, plastic tarps for God knew what purpose, but Bobby insisted they might be necessary. Bolt cutters in case they encountered locked gates. They packed food that wouldn't spoil, water bottles, first aid supplies, ammunition beyond what they could possibly need, planning for contingencies that would hopefully never materialize. At 2 p.m, Warren called a pause. They ate sandwiches in silence, 4 men sustaining bodies that would soon become instruments of methodical death. Clayton hadn't spoken in hours, his internal struggle visible in the tension around his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he picked up his coffee cup. Warren addressed him directly. "You can still walk away. Stay home. Let the 3 of us handle this." Clayton shook his head slowly. "No. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. 4 brothers. That's how Papa raised us. We don't abandon each other when things get hard." The statement hung in the air with the weight of finality, the last moment when any of them could have chosen differently, could have stopped the machinery already in motion. They synchronized their watches at 4 o'clock, a detail that seemed absurdly military but would prove essential for coordinating movements across multiple locations. Bobby had created a timeline. Target 1 at 10:45 p.m., Target 2 at 12:15 a.m., Target 3 at 2:30 a.m. if conditions allowed. Each timeline included approach routes, optimal entry points, estimated completion times, and extraction paths. It read like a military operations plan, because that's exactly what it was. Asymmetric warfare conducted by 4 men who'd spent their lives being underestimated and were about to use that advantage lethally. At 7 o'clock, as darkness settled over the mountains and temperature dropped toward freezing, the four brothers gathered one final time in Warren's kitchen. They'd sent their families away, secured their properties, made preparations that would look suspicious in retrospect but meant nothing yet. Warren pulled out a bottle of their own moonshine, poured 4 glasses, handed them around. "To Papa," he said, "to the still he built, to the legacy he left us." They drank, the copper-smooth shine burning down their throats, the taste of 3 generations of Pritchard work. "To justice," Clayton added quietly, "however we define it." They drank again. "To consequences," Donnie said, his voice hard, "for them and for us." They finished the bottle. At 9 o'clock, they loaded the trucks, checked weapons one final time, pulled on dark clothing that would blend with October night. At 9:30, they drove out of the Pritchard compound in 2 separate vehicles, heading toward destinations that would transform them from victims into perpetrators, from men who'd been wronged into men who'd crossed every civilized line. The night was cold and clear, stars visible through gaps in the trees, the moon a waning crescent providing minimal light. Perfect conditions for ghosts. Perfect conditions for 4 small men to become something the mountains would remember forever. 10:47 p.m., October 8th, 1986. Temperature 39 degrees. Humidity near 90%. After an evening rain shower, fog rolling down from the ridges in thick waves that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. Perfect conditions for men who needed to become invisible. Warren Pritchard sat in his truck, 200 yards from Ezra Shepard's trailer, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, waiting for his heart rate to slow from the adrenaline spike that had hit him when they first parked. He'd expected fear, expected his hands to shake, expected some physiological response to what he was about to do. Instead, he felt calm. Not peaceful. Nothing about this was peaceful, but calm in the way a man gets when he's made an irreversible decision and accepted all its consequences. He'd crossed the moral threshold days ago in his kitchen with his brothers. This was just the execution of a plan already set in irrevocable motion. Clayton sat in the passenger seat, checking his Browning rifle for the 3rd time, the weapon he'd used for deer hunting since 1968, now about to be used for something deer never deserved, but Ezra Shepard arguably did. Bobby and Donnie were positioned 200 yards behind them in Bobby's Chevy, watching the access road, ready to intercept anyone who might stumble onto the scene at the wrong moment. 4 men about to become something they could never unbecome. 4 brothers about to start a killing spree that would end 14 lives and destroy their own. Ezra Shepard's trailer sat in a small clearing carved from the forest, a single wide manufactured home that had seen better days, rust streaking the aluminum siding, wooden steps leading to a front door that hung slightly crooked. Lights blazed from the windows, television flickering blue and white through thin curtains, the sound of a baseball game carrying through the October night, announcers excited about something that mattered to people who weren't about to die. Warren could see Ezra's shadow moving inside, the young man's silhouette crossing back and forth between kitchen and living room, probably getting a beer from the refrigerator, probably settling in for the night with his new wife who was, according to Bobby's surveillance, working the night shift at the hospital in town and wouldn't be home until 7 a.m. "Last chance," Clayton whispered. though his tone suggested he was talking to himself more than to Warren. Last chance to be men who haven't killed. Warren looked at his brother, saw the torment there, the religious man wrestling with necessity and losing. We're past that point, Warren said quietly. We're past it the minute Ray stole the still and the sheriff refused to help. Clayton nodded, chambered around in his rifle, the metallic click somehow louder than it should have been in the fog-muffled night. Warren opened his door slowly, deliberately. The dome light had been disabled days ago. No point advertising their presence. He stepped out into the fog, felt the moisture immediate on his face, in his lungs, coating everything with dampness that carried the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves, and that particular metallic scent of approaching winter. They approached from the tree line, moving through underbrush with the practice of men who'd walked these mountains their entire lives. Their short stature an advantage now because they could duck under branches that would catch a taller man, could step over fallen logs without making noise, could navigate terrain that anyone 6 feet tall would struggle through. The fog helped, swallowing sound, creating a bubble of isolation around Ezra Shepard's trailer that made it feel like they were approaching a structure that existed outside normal space, outside normal time, outside the moral universe, where actions had conventional consequences. Warren reached the trailer's wooden steps, felt them creak under his weight, cursed silently, because surprise mattered and noise ruined surprise. He knocked 3 times, sharp raps that he hoped sounded casual, neighborly, nothing to worry about. Footsteps inside, heavier than Warren expected. Ezra Shepard was a big man like his father, 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds of muscle built from working lumber mills and hauling moonshine equipment. The door opened. Ezra stood there in jeans and a UK Wildcats t-shirt, beer in hand, that easy smile mountain people wore when a neighbor came calling. Not yet registering that the neighbor was Warren Pritchard, and Warren Pritchard had no reason to be here at almost 11 at night unless something had gone terribly wrong. The smile died when Ezra saw Warren's face, saw the rifle, saw Clayton behind him with his own weapon raised. "Mr. Pritchard," Ezra said, his voice climbing an octave, losing the casual confidence, gaining the desperate edge of someone who suddenly understood they were in danger. Warren raised his Winchester, the barrel pointed at Ezra's chest from 3 feet away, close enough that missing was impossible, close enough that he could see. Ezra's pupils dilate, could see the exact moment comprehension turned to terror. "You took something that belonged to my family," Warren said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, stating fact rather than accusation. "You and 13 others. You thought we wouldn't fight back." Ezra's hands came up, the universal gesture of surrender, the beer bottle falling to the trailer floor and shattering, the smell of cheap lager mixing with the fog and fear. Ray said it was okay, said you wouldn't care, said..." Warren pulled the trigger. The shot cut off Ezra's excuses, cut off his life, cut off any possibility that this was a nightmare Warren would wake from. Ezra fell backward through the doorway, his body crashing into the cheap furniture behind him, blood spraying across walls that would tell this story to investigators in a language that needed no translation. The baseball game continued playing, announcer excited about a home run, crowd roaring approval of violence that was sanctioned and celebrated while the violence Warren had just committed would be condemned and punished. Clayton stood frozen, staring at Ezra Shepard's body, at the first death they'd caused, at the proof that they'd transformed from theorists planning violence into practitioners executing it. "We need to go," Warren said, his voice steady despite the ringing in his ears from the gunshot, despite the smell of cordite and blood, despite the absolute knowledge that he'd just murdered a 22-year-old man who'd probably never even fired the stolen still, who'd been guilty mostly of being born a shepherd. They walked back to the truck through fog that now felt complicit, that now felt like an accomplice hiding their crime. Bobby and Donnie met them at the vehicles, saw their faces, understood without words that the threshold had been crossed, that there were now 13 more names to eliminate before this night's work would be finished. 13 more deaths required to protect a legacy that was already tarnished beyond recognition by the first death's blood. 12:23 a.m., October 9th, 1986. Temperature 37 degrees. The fog thickening into something almost solid. A white wall that swallowed headlights and turned the mountain roads into narrow tunnels leading nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Warren drove with his lights off, navigating by memory and moonlight that barely penetrated the vapor, following roads he'd known since childhood, toward Ray Shepard's main compound, where Bobby's surveillance had confirmed 5 men gathered for their regular Wednesday night poker game. Ray himself, his 2 oldest sons, Michael and Danny, his brother Randall, and his nephew Jimmy. 5 targets in one location. Nearly half the work completed in a single coordinated action if they could maintain surprise, maintain ruthlessness, maintain the momentum that Ezra Shepard's death had initiated. The compound sat on 70 acres of relatively flat land, unusual for Harlan County, where most property clung to hillsides at impossible angles. Ray's house dominated the center, a 2-story structure built in 1973 with money from moonshine sales Ray pretended came from logging contracts. Outbuildings scattered across the property, the barn where the stolen Pritchard still now operated, a garage housing Ray's collection of trucks and ATVs, a shed for equipment, a smaller cabin where Randall lived year-round. Security lighting blazed from poles around the main house, illuminating a perimeter that made direct approach impossible without being seen. But Bobby had spent 2 weeks studying this location, had identified blind spots created by the buildings themselves, had mapped approach routes that exploited the one weakness in Ray's defensive setup. He'd designed it to intimidate visitors coming up the main driveway, not to defend against attackers emerging from the tree line. The 4 Pritchard brothers parked a quarter-mile away, concealed their trucks in an abandoned logging road that hadn't seen traffic in 5 years, and moved through the forest on foot carrying weapons and certainty, and the knowledge that 5 men would die in the next 15 minutes. They split according to the plan Bobby had drawn. Warren and Clayton approaching from the west, where the barn created a shadow zone the security lights couldn't reach. Donnie and Bobby circling to the east, where the garage blocked sight lines from the main house. The goal was simple, brutal, efficient. Surround the house. Enter simultaneously from front and rear. Eliminate everyone inside before any of them could reach weapons, could call for help, could do anything except understand in their final seconds that the Pritchard brothers weren't as harmless as everyone had believed. Warren reached the barn first, pressed himself against the copper-scented wood siding where his grandfathers still hummed with active fermentation, producing shine that would never be sold, that would sit in barrels until federal agents seized it as evidence in a quadruple homicide investigation. He could hear voices from the main house 50 yards away, loud male laughter, the aggressive camaraderie of men who thought they owned the night, who thought they'd gotten away with theft, who thought the Pritchards would accept defeat and disappear into mountain poverty like so many others before them. Clayton moved beside Warren, breathing hard, his face pale, even in the darkness. The religious man reconciling himself to mass murder, one breath at a time. Bobby's signal came at 12:31 exactly. 3 quick flashes of red-filtered flashlight from the east side of the house. Warren and Clayton moved, covering the 50 yards in seconds, despite their short stature, despite carrying rifles, despite knowing they were about to commit acts that would define them forever. Warren reached the front door, found it unlocked, because mountain people still believed in the safety of isolated compounds, still believed that distance from civilization meant distance from consequences. He turned the knob slowly, pushed the door open, stepped into a mudroom that smelled like gun oil and tobacco and the particular musk of men who worked physically demanding jobs. The door to the main living area stood open. Beyond it, Warren could see 5 men gathered around a table, cards and cash and bottles scattered across the surface, faces illuminated by overhead lights that made them look younger than they were, more innocent than they deserved to appear. Michael Shepard saw Warren first, the oldest son who'd helped dismantle the Pritchard still, who'd transported it, who'd reassembled it and taught others how to use it. His face registered confusion before fear, the cognitive dissonance of seeing Warren Pritchard standing in his father's house holding a rifle like some impossible nightmare made flesh. "The hell are you doing here?" Michael said, starting to stand, his hand moving toward the pistol he kept holstered at his hip, because Ray Shepard's sons learned early that moonshining was dangerous business, requiring dangerous preparations. Warren didn't answer, didn't explain, didn't offer the speech he'd rehearsed about justice and legacy and the price of theft. He simply raised his Winchester and fired, the shot impossibly loud in the enclosed space, the .30-06 round hitting Michael in the chest and throwing him backward over his chair, blood spraying across the poker table and the men sitting around it. The room erupted into chaos. Ray Shepard lunged for a shotgun mounted on the wall behind him. Danny dove sideways toward a door that might lead to more weapons or escape or some fantasy of survival that existed only in the second before Clayton's rifle fired and took him in the side, spinning him around, dropping him onto hardwood floors that his father had installed with money stolen from better men. Randall made it 3 steps toward the back door before Bobby appeared there, small and deadly, his .357 Magnum firing twice, both rounds center mass, trained marksmanship that ended Randall's 58 years of life in the doorway between kitchen and freedom. Jimmy Shepard, 26 years old, newest member of the poker game, froze completely, his hands still holding cards, his mouth open in a scream that never quite emerged because Donnie's Mini 14 fired 3 rounds so quickly they sounded like one extended thunderclap, and Jimmy folded across the table, dead before his nervous system could process the trauma. Ray Shepard reached the shotgun, got his hands on it, was turning toward Warren when Warren fired again, deliberately lower, hitting Ray in the hip, shattering bone, and sending the older man crashing to the floor, but not killing him, not yet, because Warren had planned that this moment, specifically, had decided that Ray deserved to understand what was happening, deserved to see his family dead around him, deserved one final moment of comprehension before the darkness took him. Warren walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on spent shell casings and broken glass, and the wreckage of a poker game that would never finish. Ray lay on his back, still alive, blood pooling beneath him from the hip wound, his hands pressed against the injury in the futile biological imperative to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped. He looked up at Warren with eyes that showed pain and shock, and finally, belatedly, understanding. "You took something from my family," Warren said quietly, standing over Ray Shepard, looking down at the man who'd tormented him for 40 years, who'd called him names, who'd stolen his grandfather's legacy, and thought there would be no consequences. "You taught 13 others to use it. You thought we were too small, too weak, too beaten down to fight back." Ray's mouth worked, trying to form words, trying to explain or beg or curse. Warren couldn't tell which, and didn't care. "This is mountain justice," Warren continued. "This is what happens when the law won't help. When the system protects men like you and leaves men like us with nothing but our own hands." He raised his rifle one final time. Ray Shepard's last words were, "Please don't." The universal cry of men who've run out of options, who've discovered too late that mercy is earned, not given, that actions have consequences, even in hollows, where sheriffs look away. Warren pulled the trigger. The poker game was over. 5 men lay dead. 9 more remained on the list. The Pritchard brothers stood in Ray Shepard's living room, surrounded by bodies and gun smoke, and the irrevocable knowledge that they'd transformed from victims into something the mountains had never seen before. 4 small men who'd decided that if the world wouldn't give them justice, they'd manufacture it themselves, from gunpowder and rage and copper-pure determination. At 1:47 a.m. on October 9th, the night felt endless. Time had lost its meaning as the brothers moved in silence. Temperature was 35 degrees and the fog was beginning to lift, showing patches of sky where stars looked down, indifferent to the violence. The 4 Pritchard brothers had learned well from their army days, and now they worked in perfect coordination, driving separate vehicles to avoid communication traces. They were heading toward Marcus Webb's property, 3 miles northeast of Ray Shepard's compound. Marcus, 51, married to Ray's sister, was complicit in the theft of the Pritchard copper still. Bobby had documented Marcus's involvement with the still on 6 separate occasions. The plan was simple: simultaneous entry, overwhelming force, and no resistance. By 2:03 a.m., Warren reached the front door of Marcus's house. Without hesitation, he kicked it in, and Marcus dropped his coffee, reaching for his pistol. Warren fired first, hitting Marcus in the shoulder. Marcus Jr. emerged from the hallway disoriented. Clayton's rifle took him down quickly. David Webb, the last family member to appear, was shot by Bobby from the back door. Marcus was still alive, but barely. As Warren stood over him, Marcus, gasping for breath, tried to speak, claiming there was law and order. Warren shot him, ending his life and the Webb family's role in the war. With 3 more bodies added to their list, the brothers, numb from the violence, left the house silently, heading back to their trucks. They had already become the hunters, with the night still stretching ahead. At 4:53 a.m., the night's coldest point, the fog returned, thick and heavy. The Shepherd equipment barn stood 2 miles from Ray's house, and inside, Carl and Thomas Shepherd, both in their 20s, worked the stolen Pritchard stills. They were unaware that their time was nearly up. Warren and the others approached on foot, prepared for another swift execution. The brothers had learned to kill without hesitation, and the time for moral questions had passed. They surrounded the barn, and at 4:58 a.m., Warren kicked open the door. Inside, Carl and Thomas froze, seeing the rifles pointed at them. Carl raised his hands, but it was too late. Warren's shot tore through his chest, and Thomas was hit in the head seconds later by Clayton's rifle. Inside the barn, the hiss of steam continued, indifferent to the violence that had just taken place. The Pritchard brothers made sure no one else was inside before leaving, their task nearly complete. Warren stood by the still, feeling its warmth, but also the weight of their actions. The violence they'd been committing, meant to protect their family legacy, had only destroyed it. The brothers walked out into the early morning light, the weight of the night's work starting to settle in. At 6:12 a.m. on October 12th, the weather had warmed to 52 degrees, but the Pritchard brothers were cold inside. They had spent the past 4 days hunting down 12 men, their former associates, each one eliminated with military precision. Bobby had tracked Tyler Shepherd to Ashley Brennan's apartment, and the brothers knew that this last target would be different. Tyler was big and violent, capable of fighting back. As they approached the apartment, Warren kicked the door in, catching Ashley by surprise. Tyler, armed with a pistol, stepped into the doorway. Warren's first shot hit Tyler in the chest, but he staggered backward trying to fight. Clayton's shot followed, hitting Tyler in the side, and the enforcer collapsed. Tyler's final words, "You win," were an acknowledgement of defeat, but Warren didn't pause to savor it. The task had to be finished. Ashley screamed in horror, but Bobby intervened, shaking his head. "No," he said firmly, "we're not killing women." They left her behind, a witness to the final act of their vendetta. With Tyler dead, the Pritchard brothers completed their mission. There were still 3 men left on their list, but Warren called it off. 12 is enough, he said. The point had been made. The brothers drove home, exhausted, having crossed every line they once believed in. There would be no return to their old lives, only the cold reality of what they had become. October 12th, 1986, at 9:37 a.m., temperatures climbed towards 64 degrees, unusually warm for mid-October in Harlan County. Kentucky State Police Trooper Daniel Hutchins received the first call at 9:42 a.m., a hysterical report from Ashley Brennan about her boyfriend being shot by 4 small men who kicked in her door and executed him. Initially, Hutchins assumed domestic violence in a single incident. However, the second call at 10:18 a.m., reporting an open door at the Shepherd equipment barn and a body inside, shifted his focus. By 10:45 a.m., Kentucky State Police confirmed 12 bodies across 4 separate locations in 3 counties, all connected to the Shepherd family moonshine operation. The killings occurred within 5 days using rifles and shotguns, suggesting coordinated, systematic elimination. By 11:30 a.m., the FBI field office in Louisville had been notified. Special Agent Michelle Reeves arrived at the crime scene at 1:15 p.m., understanding that this was not gang warfare, but a personal revenge executed with military precision. Sheriff Breckinridge arrived at 1:32 p.m. and saw the bodies, realizing his negligence in dismissing a complaint about a stolen still by Warren Pritchard and his brothers. Special Agent Reeves questioned the sheriff, learning that the Pritchard brothers, all dwarfs, had been involved in the killings. "They're stronger than they look," Breckinridge said, explaining the brothers' motives: revenge for the theft of a still worth $22,000, a family legacy. By 2:47 p.m., Kentucky State Police had located the Pritchard compound, preparing for an arrest. At 4:33 p.m., the Pritchard brothers surrendered without resistance and the arrest was made, setting the stage for their trial, which would reveal the tragic consequences of seeking mountain justice. October 12, 1986. At 5:47 p.m., the sun set over Harlan County, marking the end of the Pritchard brothers' rampage. The 4 brothers, each in separate patrol cars, were taken to different holding facilities. Warren, in a Kentucky State Police cruiser, was headed to Harlan County Jail, his hands cuffed, reflecting on his shift from a free man to a convicted murderer. Clayton, traveling toward a federal facility, continued his prayers, searching for solace from a God who had remained silent during the killings. Donnie, en route to Bell County, sat in moine, quiet contemplation, realizing his rage had emptied out over time. Bobby, the strategist, analyzed their situation, knowing the overwhelming evidence would lead to a conviction, with no defense to counteract the prosecution's case. The media descended quickly, with news vans flooding Harlan County. The coverage sensationalized the story, focusing on the Pritchard brothers' physical differences rather than the complex history of marginalization that had led to the killings. Locals had mixed reactions, some understanding the brothers' actions, others condemning them as terrorists. The legal process moved swiftly, with the brothers formally charged, bail denied, and the trial set to begin in March of the following year. The Pritchard brothers were processed through the Kentucky prison system, each placed in a separate facility to prevent collaboration. Warren was sent to the maximum security Kentucky State Penitentiary, Clayton to Luther Luckett Correctional Complex, Donnie to Eastern Kentucky, and Bobby to North Point Training Center. Each brother faced the reality of life imprisonment, with their identities and routines adjusted to the harsh, isolating prison environment. Warren adapted by maintaining strict routines, building physical strength to command respect from other inmates. Clayton wrestled with faith, unable to reconcile his actions with a just God, while Donnie's violent tendencies persisted, leading to frequent altercations. Bobby, the strategist, turned intellectual, studying sociology and history, even teaching other inmates. Over the years, all 4 brothers faced personal loss, divorce, fading family connections, and isolation. Bobby's intellectual pursuits allowed him to reflect on his choices, questioning whether the violence had been worth it. Despite their sentences, the Pritchard legacy lingered in Harlan County, with mixed opinions on their actions. Some saw them as victims of circumstance, others as dangerous criminals. Ultimately, the brothers lived with the consequences of their decisions, while the story of the murders became a local legend, shaping perceptions of justice in the mountains. As of 2024, Bobby Pritchard, age 76, remains incarcerated at North Point Training Center, serving a life sentence. He continues his daily routine, reflecting on the decisions that led to the deaths of 12 men and the destruction of his family. Most of his relatives have distanced themselves, changing their names and moving away from the stigma of the Pritchard name. The Pritchard family property was sold after being seized through civil forfeiture, and the house where the planning for the murders took place was demolished in 1993. The land changed hands multiple times, but the memories of what occurred there remained in the community. The cemetery where Warren, Clayton, and their father are buried still exists, though their legacy is one of tragedy and violence. The copper still that had sparked the violence was auctioned off, ultimately ending up in a private museum, where it sits as a historical artifact, detached from the bloodshed it caused. The debate over whether legacy is worth killing for continues, with Bobby acknowledging that they were wrong, but admitting he would likely make the same choices again, under the same circumstances. His story, and the Pritchard family's, lives on as a cautionary tale in the mountains.